Welcome to Maya's Classes and Podcast. I'm Sarah, and I'm here with Mark. This is our 4th episode, and we're excited to share some useful tips, stories, and a little bit of our own experiences with learning English.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We'll be talking about our personal journeys with learning English, the challenges we've faced, and hopefully offering some practical advice to help you on your own language learning adventure.
Exactly. So, Mark, let's start by talking about your journey. When did you first start learning English? What inspired you to begin?
Well, I think like many people, English was part of my education from an early age. But it wasn't until I traveled abroad for the first time that I realized how essential it is. I couldn't really communicate properly, and that frustrated me. I knew I had to improve if I wanted to connect with people and understand the world around me. What about you, Sarah?
I completely understand that feeling. For me, English has always been part of my life because I grew up watching English movies and listening to English songs. But when I started traveling, I realized I needed to improve my speaking skills to feel more confident. I think the moment I decided to really focus on English was when I found myself struggling to have a basic conversation with someone while traveling. That's when I knew I needed to invest more time into learning.
I think that's a very relatable experience. For me, speaking was the hardest part. It was easy enough to read and write, but when it came to real-life conversations, I was scared to speak up. I feared making mistakes and not being understood. How about you? Did you face similar challenges?
Oh, absolutely. Speaking was definitely my biggest challenge. There's this fear of making mistakes, especially when you're trying to sound natural, right? I used to be very self-conscious about my accent and would second-guess myself every time I wanted to speak. I think it took me a long time to realize that making mistakes is a normal part of learning.
Yeah, I think that's a big obstacle for many learners. It's easy to feel embarrassed or discouraged. But the truth is, everyone makes mistakes, even native speakers. It's a natural part of communication. I started practicing with small things, like ordering food at restaurants or asking for directions. These little conversations helped me build confidence.
That's such a good strategy. I also started with small steps. But I'll be honest, when I tried to speak English in public, it felt like my brain would freeze up. I think it's important to remember that even if you don't get everything right, as long as the person understands what you're saying, you've done your job.
Right. Communication is the goal, not perfection. But how did you get past that feeling of freezing up when trying to speak?
One thing that helped me was listening. I started listening to English podcasts, watching English movies with subtitles, and reading books in English. This way, I could hear how sentences were structured and pick up new vocabulary. I think the more exposure you have to the language, the easier it gets to understand and respond. What did you do to overcome that fear of speaking?
For me, it was all about practice. I found language exchange partners, people who were learning my native language, and we would practice English together. I also started using language apps that helped me practice speaking with native speakers. At first, it was tough, but over time, it got easier. I think it also helped me to realize that people are usually more interested in understanding you than in judging your mistakes.
I love that. It's about creating a safe space to practice. I think, for me, one of the biggest breakthroughs was realizing that even if my accent wasn't perfect, as long as I made an effort, people appreciated it. It's about connecting with others, not about sounding perfect.
Absolutely. And listening is such an important part of learning, too. For me, listening to podcasts and watching English shows helped me pick up the natural flow of the language. It's different from what you see in textbooks, right? You hear real conversations, slang, and expressions that you might not find in a classroom setting.
Yes, podcasts are fantastic for this. You hear how people speak naturally, and it's a great way to learn vocabulary that's used in real-world situations. What about grammar? I know that for many learners, grammar can be a huge challenge. Did you struggle with grammar when you were starting out?
Oh, definitely. I found grammar to be quite difficult, especially the tenses and the word order. At first, I was very focused on making sure everything was grammatically perfect, but that slowed me down when it came to speaking. I realized I had to let go of the need for perfection and focus more on communicating. Over time, I learned the rules more naturally by practicing and listening to how native speakers used them.
I can relate to that. I also spent a lot of time worrying about grammar when I should have just been speaking more. It's easy to get caught up in the details and forget that the goal is communication. But I think when you start using the language in context, through conversation and listening, it starts to make sense. Grammar becomes something you feel, rather than something you force yourself to memorize.
Exactly. Grammar is important, but you don't have to be perfect at it from the start. It's like building muscle, you get stronger as you keep practicing. And I think it's also helpful to remember that some of the most common English mistakes are the easiest to fix once you start speaking more.
That's such a good point. I always tell people not to be afraid to make mistakes because every mistake is a step toward improvement. And you don't have to know every single grammar rule right away. It'll come with time. So, let's talk about vocabulary now. How do you remember all the new words you learn?
Vocabulary is tricky, for sure. I've used a lot of different methods, but one that works for me is creating flashcards. I write down the word on one side and a sentence using that word on the other side. That helps me connect the word to a real-life situation. I also try to use new words in conversations as soon as I can. The more I use them, the easier it is to remember them.
I do something similar. I try to learn words in context, so I don't just memorize the meaning. I think it's important to see how words fit together in phrases and sentences. Also, when I learn a new word, I'll try to use it in a conversation within a day or two. That way, it sticks better.
That's a great method. And one thing I've learned is to be patient. You don't have to learn everything all at once. I think it's more effective to learn a few words every day and keep practicing them, rather than trying to learn hundreds of words at once.
Definitely. Learning vocabulary is a marathon, not a sprint. You don't have to know everything right away. Just keep practicing, and over time, it'll add up. So, before we end, what would be your top piece of advice for someone who's just starting to learn English?
I would say, don't be afraid to make mistakes. They're part of the learning process. Also, try to surround yourself with English as much as possible. Listen to podcasts, watch movies, read books, and most importantly, practice speaking. You'll improve faster than you think.
I couldn't agree more. I would also say, don't compare yourself to others. Everyone learns at their own pace, and that's okay. Celebrate your small victories, and remember that it's all about progress, not perfection.
Well said, and remember, learning English is a journey, not a race. It's okay to take your time and enjoy the process.
Exactly. So, that's all for today's episode of Learning English Together. We hope you've found some useful tips, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us. Everyone, keep practicing, and we'll be back soon with more advice.
Happy learning, and take care.
Bye.